Hey, today we're out at the CMU WCCC compost facility. We want to talk a little bit of composting here today. Whole different variety of reasons why we would like to compost. The biggest one would be cycling nutrients, because we can put nutrients into the soil, we can do fertilizer, we can do anything we'd like to grow these plants, and the plants pull nutrients up into the stalk, and they pull it up into the branches and into the leaves, and ultimately they put in the fruit that we consume and we get to eat. But even though we've taken the tomato off of that vine, or we take the cucumber off that plant, there's still nutrients in the majority of that plant. So we tend to think of just composting food waste and scraps that we have around our house, but also the entire plant can be composted. And that is a way of taking all those nutrients and all the minerals and all the vitamins that are in that plant and then turning them into a soil amendment that can be put back into the soil. So the more creative things that we can get a hold of and compost in the way of leaves and bark and well, dog hair and cardboard Q-tips and diversity, junk mail, wood chips, the list goes on and on. We'll talk a little bit more about that here pretty soon. But when we can take all these things that are considered a waste item and compost them down to turn them back into nutrients that can go back into the soil, that's a really good form of sustainable growing, where you're closing in loops, that you don't have waste product being thrown away, but you're actually taking that waste and making it into something valuable. Another opportunity would be that those of us that have access to land, we can get a big old pile of brush or a big pile of leaves or straw or hay that went moldy, or yard trimmings and that, and when you compost it down, you reduce it in size incredibly, and then now this is a beautiful rich material that can be spread back out in the yard that has really good nutrients. But there's another thing going on. Decomposition happens, right? You can go up in the mountains and you see that decomposition happens in nature because of the microbiology. There's all different classes of bacteria and protozoa, silogene, amoeba, flagellates, right? And then all the different types of fungi and the nematodes and all the little critters, insects, right? Beetles and worms that are chewing down that plant debris and making it, if you've got a plant root, it's finite in what it can absorb. And if you've got this big old chunk of leaf or organic matter, manure, whatever it might be, the root can't access that. So by using the power of the microbiology feeds on that form that we used to know as a leaf and turns it into carbon, hydrogen, magnesium, calcium, right? Turns it into small elements that now that plant root can get access to, and now we get a feed source. So when you're composting, not only are you making nutrients and cycling that, so it's not going to the waste stream, the landfill, but also you're bringing in the power of microbiology, so that when you put this amendment back in your soil, you're adding A, nitrogen source, and B, a nutrient source, and B, the microbiology that can feed on not just that compost, but any other plant debris and organic matter that you have hanging around your soil. So it's a double win that is really good for all soil conditions. You can put it around trees, you can put it around shrubs, obviously our vegetable plants and different crops that we like to grow. This pile is a little bit older. You can, when I dig back here, now we get down to a little fungal count, and I'm hoping you can see the steam rising off of that. That's a really nice healthy pile going on there. There's 4 components to making quality compost, 4 of them. This is a more freshly started pile down on the end here. Number 1 is that what we do here is we take food waste. So you can see some bits of onion here and some bell pepper and a little bit of celery. These are all nitrogen rich, so anything green, grass clippings, raw animal manure, vegetable trimmings, grass clippings, those are all things that are seaweed, right? Those are all things that are green, they're nitrogen source. So if you took a pile of grass that you had cut and you let it sit for a long time, over time it would decompose. That's not compost though, because it's slimy and it would ooze out the bottom, and you might get a temperature spike in the middle, but on the outside it's kind of going brown as it dries out, but in the inside it's goopy, it's anaerobic. That's not quality compost. That's decomposition happening, and it would take time. When you mix those green rich items with brown rich items, those are our carbon source. So leaves, ground up branches, newspaper, wood chips, sawdust, anything that's brown when it comes to you is considered a carbon-rich item. So, same example, if you took a bunch of dried leaves and you put a pile of leaves out in your yard, over time they would slowly decompose and nature would happen, and down in the bottom it would decompose faster because that's in contact with the soil, and up top it would just stay as dry leaves, and it could go for a generation before it breaks down. Well, if that's too carbon rich, right? That's too dry. That will take time to decompose, but that's not compost. Compost is when we're taking nitrogen and carbon in a balanced level so that the microbiology can feed on all of it evenly and it decomposes all at the same rate. So what we're doing in compost is making the best living environment for the microbiology. Just like everything else, they want food, water, air, shelter. They want everything else just like we want, right? So when you take the food source as the nitrogen and the carbon, and when you blend that so that it's, in average, what we're looking for is 30 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. So if you do that pile of dried grass, grass comes in at 17 to 1. That's too low. That's a lot of nitrogen rich that's not going to decompose. Leaves come in around 60 to 80 to 1. That's a very high carbon source. On their own, they won't decompose. But if you take grass at 17 to 1 and leaves at 60 to 1, 17 to 1 and 60 to 1, blend those together, 30 to 1. I do recommend that the first time that you're out playing around with it, you do get a bathroom scale. You can take a pickle bucket, weigh it on the scale, and then put in some food waste, put in some leaves, and kind of work on your recipe. And you can do the math as well. I can get you the information on the formula for doing that, or you can find online compost formula for carbon-nitrogen ratio. But when your carbon-nitrogen ratio is balanced, that's the food catalyst that makes the microorganisms go crazy. That's when they start to propagate and they start multiplying and go into a frenzy over it. I'm also a fan of using animal manure. This would be dried horse manure. You can see it's quite aged so that any of the residual urine is not a strong ammonia component, but it is dissipated. I like the bacteria that comes in animal manure is not like bacteria you can get anywhere else. So in the recipe that we use here at the compost facility, we do 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if we fill up a 5-gallon bucket or a wheelbarrow or a big trash can full of our nitrogen source, being the food waste that we gather from the university and from the college dining services, whatever our food waste is, we quantify that and then do 2 parts leaves. So we collect leaves from the city of Grand Junction. They come and bring us a big old dumpster full. Otherwise, I recommend harvesting all those leaves in the fall and holding onto them in plastic bags so that you can use them all through the winter time and through the summer while the leaves are growing again. And then if you can find someone that has access to manure, I really like horse manure because the folks around here feed their horses a really nice diet and they're not giving them growth hormones and steroids. I'm very concerned about that with cattle because a lot of cattle are also free-ranging out on public lands and eating a lot of weed seed, and that can come into your compost pile and that doesn't help things at all. I'm a big fan of llama and rabbit because they don't carry diseases. They're a small pellet form that breaks down as a manure, and they're consistent where they poop. You can always scoop it up so easy. You have to do special modifications to be able to harvest chicken manure, and then goat and sheep try to find it. They just poop wherever they're standing. It's really difficult to harvest their manures, but not bad to use as well. So in the process of making our compost then, so I told you that carbon-nitrogen ratio is the #1. So we'll put down a layer of leaves, throw down some food waste, put down another layer of leaves, and then throw in a couple shovelfuls of manure. And we'll get that going. And then we get some more food waste here in a couple days, so we'll do the same thing. Layer, lasagna style, layer. Once you get a good, these are big piles. They're about 5 feet tall and they're really nice to work with. 5 foot wide, 5 foot deep by 5 feet tall. At my house I use pallets. So I have a pallet laying down and then pallets on 3 sides with a stabilizer 2x4 on the top to hold it together. I get my pile going minimum of 3 feet. 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot is when you've got enough volume to get quality compost going. It's very difficult to compost in a very small pile, and then obviously very big piles you need equipment. So that's when you bring in a front load tractor or a skid steer to be able to work the pile for you. And there's entire equipment that'll do compost turning for you, but that's thousands and thousands of dollars and a lot to get involved with. So number one, carbon to nitrogen ratio is the food source for the microbiology, and just like every other living thing, they need water. 50% moisture ideally is what we're looking for. So you should be able to reach into a compost pile and you should be able to roll it up into a ball, and it's kind of a big, so there's a nice ball there. This is a real good moisture. I can see it glistening with moisture. When I squeeze it really hard, there's no water coming out, so I'm not saturated. It's not totally dry where this would not make a ball, where it's so dry that it just falls apart. But when I dig down into the pile, I can make a nice ball that holds its shape. I can even take this ball and manipulate it into kind of a sausage. That would put this at about 75% moisture. So it might be a little high on the moisture, but with our dry conditions and we're getting some nice spring winds, we'll lose moisture. But if we don't have water available, the microbiology is not going to thrive. The reason we don't want 100% saturated where we can wring it out is because, just like all living things, number 3, air. Microbiology needs air to thrive. So we have a couple options. One, we can come out with our handy pitchfork and we can bust down in the center and then flip up on the sides and kind of work the pile around and, you know, get it in here and stab it up. Look at this pile. Look at this. Look at that. When you have got condition number 1, 2, and 3, and you are making happy microbiology, they produce to you. Number 4 would be temperature. When those microbiology are thriving, when they're propagating, when they're procreating and multiplying in populations, they put off carbon dioxide. That's how they respire. Their carbon dioxide comes off as heat. Look at the amount of heat in this pile. And not only that, look at that, but look at this. Also, all those little white spots there, that would indicate fungal growth. But when you look really close here, those are a little dot pattern. That's protozoa. Protozoa is a thermophilic class of microbiology that takes off. That is the number 1 catalyst that makes the best compost out there. We've had the opportunity, I've been able to take different types of mushroom spent materials, brew waste, introducing more fungal dominant kind of ingredients to your compost if you'd like to push your compost into a more fungal rich pile, right? The bacteria will come, it will find you. Every living thing has natural beneficial bacteria on it, in it, all over it. So when you can pick up a diversity of products, we're blessed here at the culinary department because we get access to pineapples and fruit shipped in from Latin America and vegetables grown here locally. So everything's bringing in those different diversity of microorganisms. So when we put them in here into our compost, holy cow, it rocks out. So I recommend aerating about every 3 days. Another opportunity on aeration would be you can take this nifty little stabber guy that has these little wings here, and when you pop them into the pile and then pull it back out, resistance pops out those wings. So when I stab down into my pile, I can work this down and give it a little turn, those wings will popped out, and now I can come up and lift that dude and I can get in here and aerate up pretty quickly. Actually, I can come out and do an entire pile in about 30 seconds and just aerate it. Now look at all the heat coming out of that. That's a fantastic recipe going right there. That's gonna make some quality compost. At least if every 3 days you can get air out to your pile, you will make better quality compost. I still do recommend coming in about every 5 days and doing a really good turn. Because what can happen is inside the pile, you'll get the best composting action where there's protection from UV rays, where the temperature, where the food sources are the most consistent. So in the center of your pile, you'll get really good composting happen and all the parent material still on the outside. So if you're just stabbing and aerating, you know, I've seen people do PVC pipes and not want to aerate at all, and that's not making quality compost. But when you can come in with a pitchfork and actually turn, you homogenize those materials. You bring that outer dry material into the center, disperse out all those populations that have been reproducing in the middle, and distribute them evenly through the pile. You make a homogeneous pile that's a more consistent layer, and every time you turn, it shrinks down in size because the microbiology is feeding it down and it's turning it into small granular type forms. I also do recommend, if you can get yourself a hold of some long prong composting probes, because when you hit 131 degrees for a period of 5 solid days, you can kill weed seeds, you can kill diseases, you can kill, well, you don't kill, but you can break apart branch chain carbon atoms that are in the form of chemical waste, as a form of chemical fertilizers or herbicides that might be in some of the residue. When you hit temps and you can hold those temps, you're cleansing the soil, breaking apart those branch chain carbon atoms that are no longer considered a chemical, but now they're considered carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, right? Now they can become elements and break down into the soil. I'm looking at these here. We have 135 on one temperature probe and about 137 maybe on the other one. So we are definitely over our 131 here. And we keep a sheet for every one of the compost bins. We document the ingredients that went into it. When we've got to that 5-foot pile to start composting, that means quit adding more food scraps and now let the process go. What we see is in the matter of the first week or two, we see an incredible spike in temperature. And then the temperature slowly levels off. So right now this pile is still peaked on temperature, and it's been hanging out about the same temperature for about a week now. When we see those temperatures start to gradually come down, that's the conditioning phase. And that might take up to 3 or 4 months depending on the quality of compost you're making. But as that temperature drops down, once you're able to check it, right, you can do it with your hands, stick your hand in the pile. If it no longer feels hot, now you know it's conditioned all the way out. Don't add hot compost to your soil. Number one, the temperatures can kill some of your plants. Number two, if your carbon and nitrogen aren't fully broken down, you can upset the balance of carbon and nitrogen in your soil. That can be detrimental. But more importantly, you've still got all this aggregate material that's not in a fully broken down stage. So when you see that temperature spike and that gradual leveling off, you know that you spiked microbiology, you've increased the diversity and the numbers of population the best you can, and now they slowly die off over time and they quit respiring and making heat in the process. So if we hop on over this way here, this pile here is a completely finished pile, and it is conditioned down, and it is absolutely gorgeous. There is no sign of parent material. You don't see apple cores, you don't see watermelon rind in there. This is a very stabilized form. It's cool to the touch. It's very granular. That can just be tossed right around on top of a garden soil. As far as application, I like to put this down in the springtime. I like to dig a hole and then put the compost down in the hole and be able to mix it in the soil and then plant plants over the top so the roots can go down and find that nutrient source. That can be a little tricky on fruit trees, perennial plants, shrubs, ornamentals. That can be a little problematic. So then in that instance, you're sprinkling the compost around the plants, and you can dig it into the soil a little bit. Throughout the year, I like to make compost tea. I take this aggregate material, soak it in a bag in water with some air, aerate it up, turn this aggregate into a liquid form. Then I can go out and do a liquid fertilizer application in the middle of the growing season when the plants need it. So a lot of the tomatoes and peppers will come to maturity in midsummer. It's nice to give them a little boost of some liquid compost and get a better fruit set that way. You can do a foliar feed right onto the surface of the plants, and the plants can absorb the nutrients, or you can drip that around on the soil and work those nutrients down into the plant root zone that way. I'm also a fan of taking compost and doing a broad application in the fall, working it into the soil to help condition the soil all over wintertime. So basically you can use compost year-round is what I'm saying there. One thing to point out super rich, earthy. There are no flies, there's no smell, there's no stink of rotten eggs. That's not quality compost because your carbon nitrogen ratio got skewed. Typically sulfur stinky is too much nitrogen. Think back to that wet pile of green grass, right? If you're putting too nitrogen rich of compost, in the end you're going to have stinky, slimy as a result. On the other hand, if you're going way too carbon rich and you're using way too much wood material, sawdust, chips, those kinds of things, you're going to have a very loose, it's not going to be as homogenized. You'll have a lot of big chunk material and it'll have more of a woody smell than that earthy, rich type smell. Which, by the way, the microbiology make a lot of humic acid, and that's what really gives the compost that rich smell. Real quick then, when you are composting, boy, that is so nice there. That feels really nice. I love composting in the winter because you can just put your hands right in that and it warms them right up to the bone. That's a really nice, beautiful pile. It's still cranking on the temperature there. Couple things that can't go into compost. Human, dog, cat poop. We're carnivores. We have biology within us that's not healthy for the soil. So our manure has to be preconditioned down, and you've seen that in RVs. They have that blue goopy stuff. It's a bacterial component they pre-treat human and cat and dog waste with. I do know some people that shy away from pig manure for that same reason. They have an alimentary digestive system just like we do. So pigs can be a little bit of a problem. Ruminants are a really good manure source for that reason because they have the multiple stomachs and they can really break down the cellulose and the all the components there into a real good food source for the microbiology. No glass, metal, right? Things that don't biodegrade. We don't want to be putting those things into the compost. That's pretty straightforward. Watch yourself on fats and oils. That can be problematic. Meats can go rancid. Watch yourself on cheeses, dairy products, oil. That's where a lot of times we're doing pre-consumer food waste out of the restaurants because the food that comes back with all the pasta sauce and salad dressing on it can go rancid in the composting process. So that's not going to help things at all. I'm a little bit concerned about diseased plant material. If I have powdery mildew on my cucumbers and then I put that powdery mildew into my compost pile and propagate that form of fungus, that may not be such a good thing. If you're hitting good temperatures and you're on your game and you're hitting the 131 for 5 days minimum, go for it. You can kill that powdery mildew. As a general rule, pulling a plant that you know has fusarium or vermiculite and putting it into your compost pile, that's watch yourself on that one. I'm a little bit concerned on that. I don't put any weed seed into my compost pile. I cut all my weeds as they've blossomed up before they go to flower, so I know they haven't pollinated and set any weed seeds. So I go out and I cut all the weeds around my yard. I can either do a weed whacker and then rake it up, or I can do a rotary mower and then scoop it up that way. Great nitrogen source, great nutrients being cycled. Just don't put the weed seed in because then you'll propagate it all over the place. Otherwise, I do keep things you can compost. I keep a little bin, a little plastic bin with a snap-on lid right next to on the kitchen counter next to the sink. And as I'm chopping and dicing all my food scraps, go right in. I mentioned junk mail, all your yard trimmings, anything that you're going to put in your compost pile that is, organic in origin, right, as decompostable. The more surface area you can chop it up, the better the microbiology will feed on it. Because if you just take one square cut of apple or the whole apple, right, all you've got is that surface area that the microbiology can feed on. But when the more cuts and the more you chop it up and pulverize it, now you've exposed all that more surface area and you'll get a better microbiology consumption that way. They can consume it a whole lot better. I'm a big fan of dumping out the vacuum cleaner into the compost because in my house it's soil that I've carried in on my shoes, a little bit of dog hair, some food scraps, a little bit of popcorn, right? That's all decomposable. Fingernails are a real good source. Hair, mine and the dog's. When I brush the dog or when I cut my own hair, I throw that right in the compost pile. I mentioned, of course, all the food waste, tea bags, cotton balls, junk mail shredded up, You know, watch yourself on the Slick magazine kind of things. You know, I'm not a fan of that. Yeah, whole number of items all around the house that don't need to be thrown into the landfill that could be gone into the compost pile instead. So I do keep 2 compost piles at my house. One is the active pile that I'm working on where I'm adding my food waste, and every time I get a bucket full of food waste on my counter, I do 2 buckets of leaves and supplement it in, and then mix in some water and do a little bit of manure as well. And then so I've got my active pile going, and then once I get that to a big enough point, I quit adding to that one and I switch over to the second bin. So I have 2 3-sided wood pallet bins put together, and now I'm working on a new pile while the other one's conditioning, and I can take the temperatures, and I'm seeing the temperature that spiked, and now at home I'm seeing the temperature start coming down, and so I'm actively working on another pile and building it up, you know, as I generate food scraps. At my house I don't make near as much food scraps as we do here at the culinary department, so hence we need much more space. This is a nifty design with the U-channel because these boards can slide in and out of place, and so we can build bigger bins, or we can put blocks of wood in between and allow for better aeration between them. It's also nice because in a volume of pile like this, it's very difficult to homogenize the ingredients with just stabbing it. So we actually physically move a pile over, and so we keep an empty spot every 2 or 3 so that we can have a location to keep flipping the piles into. And then we also use carpets because we run in a very dry climate here. We get some wind issues where some of our piles can blow a little bit, but more so it's the heat and wind removing moisture from the compost. And if we want to stay at that nice 50 to 75% moisture range, if we don't have the carpets on, then we can lose a lot of moisture, and that's a little problematic. It's really nice in the winter time to come out, and the piles that are active that we're working won't have any snow on them because the heat coming out, whereas the piles that are have conditioned and they're going dormant and slowing down, they'll retain snow on them because they're not putting out as much heat. So from that point of view, I do know of folks doing solar greenhouses, especially up like Canada, Alaska, Yukon, and they'll build a compost pile right in the middle of their solar greenhouse, you know, in like November, December, and get the temps up rocking out while they need the BTUs. So this becomes a heat source, and in the center of their small solar greenhouse, 131 degrees coming off this dude, and you can just keep feeding it in those balances for a number of months to keep those temps up, and then when it's ready to condition out, pull that out, let it condition somewhere else, and start a new pile in your solar greenhouse. So that's another nifty reason why everybody in the world should be composting. We'll wrap it up now with this one. Feel free to email me if you have other questions, comments, and we'll tune back in and talk about some compost tea and some worm composting here at a later date. Rock on.